In this edition, Professors Kevin Winthrop and Leonard Calabresi preview an upcoming highlights from ACR 2020 course, available soon on the CSF. The first two presentations from Professor Kevin Winthrop focus on COVID-19. Here he reviews COVID-19 infections in RA patients receiving biologic and targeted synthetic DMARDs.
So this was a systematic review that included 8 observational cohort studies comprised of over 6,000 patients with various rheumatic diseases. And of these patients, 123 or 2% had COVID-19 either confirmed or met a case definition of likely or highly probable. Most of these patients, well, I should say the majority had RA, only 28% were RA, but that was the majority of the group. And the proportion of patients who had COVID-19 in this assessment who are on biologics was 68%, and 31% were on TNF blockers. Only 6% were on JAK inhibitors. Among those with SARS-CoV-2 in this assessment, of the 123 patients, 91 were not hospitalized. So the vast majority were not hospitalized, 73%. And among those remaining that were hospitalized, 11% of the total required ICU admission. And overall, 4 patients of the 123 patients died. So that was 3.2% of total. So what did this systematic review tell us? It suggested that the incidence of COVID-19 infection was fairly low. It wasn't higher than what one would expect in the rheumatic disease population. Most patients had a fairly mild clinical course, and the percent of patients hospitalized or dying from COVID seemed to be in line with what we'd see with the general population, or maybe even better, but certainly not higher. So what's this worth? Well, it's a cohort study. It's observational. We need more data. We need larger data sets, and they are out there. They're being published, and the COVID Global Alliance has been very important for rheumatology in that regard, and I look forward to seeing more data out there.
Staying with COVID-19, Professor Winthrop elaborates on the adherence of patients with rheumatic disease treated with biologics or targeted synthetic DMARDs.
So lastly, adherence in patients with chronic rheumatic diseases treated with biologics and synthetics targeted therapies during this pandemic. This was a telephone interview survey conducted in Spain where 400 patients were phoned and asked about their management of their DMARD therapy during the COVID-19 pandemic. Interestingly, 8% or 32 patients had discontinued their treatment, mostly out of fear of suffering the infection of COVID-19. Several had discontinued. About 28% of those who had discontinued had discontinued because they thought they might have COVID. And very few, only 6% or 2 patients had discontinued due to confirmed COVID. Interestingly, 58% of patients knew about the use of anti-rheumatic drugs for the treatment of COVID-19. Of course, there are a number of drugs under study, including several of the drugs frequently used in rheumatology, both JAK inhibitors, TNF blockers, IL-6 inhibitors, IL-1 inhibitors. There's a number of drugs that are in the midst of being studied for this condition. So in conclusion, it was interesting to me that adherence to treatment for rheumatic diseases was actually quite high in the city of Madrid, which was hit very hard by the COVID epidemic in the spring. And interestingly also that many of these patients understood that these drugs may have a benefit and they might have a risk, and that we just don't know yet. So the main reason that the patients who did discontinue, which was the minority, of course, was the fear that their drugs might worsen their outcomes. And again, I think that's still an open question. In a later program, perhaps maybe Len and I will be back to review where we are with COVID-19 therapeutics. It's a very fluid field, but as you're aware, some of these studies have recently emerged, including the baricitinib on top of remdesivir study, which showed some added benefit with baricitinib as compared to remdesivir alone. So these type of things are starting to come out. We'll know more. And really, I'll just echo that we need RCT data, randomized control trial data, to really understand the risks and benefits of these therapies.
In the next presentation, Professor Calabresi analyzes the response between upadacitinib and adalimumab among patients with RA and a prior inadequate response to methotrexate.
So this is Professor Nash from Australia, who look at the sustainability of response between upadacitinib and adalimumab. Everybody knows, there's head-to-head drug, 2 drugs in one house. And upadacitinib wound up besting adalimumab in multiple variables. So they wanted to look and see what happens if you follow these down the line. Next slide. This is the entire data analysis, and it speaks for itself. During the last follow-up visit, you can see the difference of 51 versus 45% in reaching CDI remission. They separate and it persists. And then if you look at low disease activity, you obviously have more patients responding, and that persists. So again, this is a continuation of a theme that has been seen throughout the upadacitinib development program, that at best adalimumab, not crushing, but clearly separates in a statistical fashion. Next. And that is the conclusion of this, that through 72 weeks, there were numerically higher proportions retaining response among the upadacitinib treated patients.
In the final presentation, Professor Calabresi gives us a final look into this ACR 2020 course. He examines the comparative effectiveness of abatacept versus tofacitinib in patients that were ACPA positive.
Now let's look at the comparative effectiveness of ABA versus TOFA after 6 months of treatment in patients with RA who were CCP positive. This is from Leslie Harold. And this was done on a U.S. national observational study. Next. So it's interesting that abatacept's been around for a long time. A number of years ago, it was considered to be kind of like a weak hitter in this class, and then it was compared to adalimumab and demonstrated that it was equally potent to a TNF inhibitor. Since that time, there have been data to suggest that there may be preferential control of disease when you use abatacept in ACPA positive patients. So this is taking on tofacitinib. This is a tall task. Now, this wasn't a head-to-head trial by any means, but it was a well-done trial. They looked at for patients who were ACPA positive and who had initiated ABA or TOFA and had at least 6 months of follow-up. And then they were matched 1-to-1 on a number of prior biologics, duration of RA, education, number of prior other therapies, time on therapy, baseline CDI. It was a well-adjusted study. So the next slide tells the answer to this. And the short answer is that there were no significant differences. If you look at p-values, there's nothing here. But if you actually look at the trends, abatacept was not the weak hitter in this group. And if you actually look at change of baseline to 6 months in CDI, numerically, clearly tilts ABA, and change in baseline at 6 months in CDI clearly tilts ABA. And then, adjusting it for prior therapies, shows that the naive patients are doing the best, and most experienced patients there was the least. So in this adjusted analysis, there was no significant differences in the means and CDI scores at 6 months for these 2 drugs, which I think is pretty interesting. And then our conclusions are that there were numerically greater mean change in CDI at 6 months in ABA versus TOFA. And I think that being ACPA positive does mean something for that drug. and additional studies to explore these findings in a larger population be required, and I think would be very, very interesting.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Insights at ACR 2020. Make sure to subscribe to the CSF podcast channel on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts from, so you don't miss out on our other ACR 2020 content, like our condensed daily highlights of the ACR Congress. If you found this informative, why not listen to our regular podcasts, which include author interviews and a monthly review of the latest cytokine signaling papers, hosted by the CSF chairman, Professor Ian McInnes. You can also visit cytokinesignaling.com for access to a wide range of free educational resources, including monthly slide summaries of the latest papers and accredited CME courses.